I've been a search and rescue officer for 7 years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the forest doesn't care about your company culture. It doesn't care about your quarterly goals, your synergy, or your desperate need to please a middle manager named Greg, who wears Patagonia vests and thinks nature is a networking opportunity. This story comes from Maya. Maya was a junior analyst at a high-pressure tech firm in Seattle. You know the type, the kind of place where work-life balance is a phrase they put on posters, but fire you for actually practicing. It was March, and the company decided on a mandatory voluntary wilderness bonding retreat. 3 days in the Olympic Peninsula. No phones, just pure, unadulterated teamwork. Maya told me that by the second day, she was reaching her breaking point. Her manager, a man who viewed empathy as a bug in the system rather than a feature, decided the group was moving too slowly. He wanted to reach the ridge before sunset to do a vision alignment exercise. He pointed to a dense, unmapped thicket of old-growth cedar and hemlock. "We're taking a shortcut," he said. Maya protested. She pointed out that the trail markers were behind them, that the light was failing, and that they weren't equipped for off-trail scrambling. But in that corporate ecosystem, safety concerns are just negative energy. Her boss looked her in the eye and said, "Maya, I need you to show some leadership here. Don't be a bottleneck." So they went in. Within 20 minutes, the mist rolled in, that thick Pacific Northwest soup that swallows sound and light. Maya tripped. A root caught her ankle, and she went down hard. By the time she stood up and wiped the damp needles from her face, the voices of her colleagues were gone. No snapping branches, no motivational shouting, just the heavy, wet silence of the woods. She wandered for an hour, calling out, her voice flat and thin against the moss. That's when she saw it. In the middle of a perfectly circular clearing, where the trees seemed to lean away from the center, sat a chair. It wasn't a camp chair or a log. It was a high-end, ergonomic office chair. Black mesh, chrome base, perfectly clean. No pine needles, no bird droppings, no dampness. It looked like it had been unboxed 5 seconds ago. Maya was exhausted. Her adrenaline was crashing, and her professional instinct to stay composed was failing. She thought, maybe this is a prank. Maybe the team is waiting for me. She sat down. The moment her weight hit the mesh, the forest changed. The wind didn't just stop, it died. And then she heard it. From the canopy above, 100 feet up in the dark branches of the cedars, came a sound she knew better than her own mother's voice. Click, clack, clack, click. The sound of 60 people typing on mechanical keyboards, rapid fire, aggressive, the sound of a deadline. Maya looked up, squinting into the dark needles, and saw a faint blue flickering light, the exact hue of a computer monitor, reflecting off the bark of the trees. Every time she tried to stand up, the typing got louder, faster, more frantic, like a manager hovering over her shoulder. A voice sounding exactly like her boss, but distorted, as if played through a broken Zoom connection, whispered from the shadows behind the chair, "Maya, we're not seeing the engagement we expected from you. Are you truly part of this team?" She didn't wait for the performance review. She bolted. She ran until her lungs burned like lye, ignoring the branches that clawed at her skin. She found our SAR team by pure luck near the trailhead at 3 a.m. When we found her, she wasn't crying. She was just staring at her hands. She told us she didn't want to go back to the parking lot. She asked us if we could delete her account. We checked that clearing the next day. There was no chair, no blue light. But at the base of the largest cedar, we found a stack of dry, white printer paper. Every single sheet was blank except for a tiny blood-red stamp in the corner of the final page that read, "Terminated." If you spend enough time on the darker corners of Reddit, the threads where people stop talking about politics and start talking about the things they saw that weren't quite right, you'll run into the concept of the uncanny valley. It's that biological alarm bell that rings when something looks 99% human, but that final 1% is wrong. It's a survival mechanism. It's your lizard brain screaming that there is a predator wearing a mask of your best friend. In the search and rescue world, we don't call it the uncanny valley. We call it the mirage. This story involves a woman named Elena and her younger sister, Sophie. Elena was a classic high achiever, living in a tiny, expensive apartment in the city, working 60 hours a week in digital marketing, surviving on iced coffee and dry shampoo. She was the personification of the hustle, Sophie, on the other hand, was 19, impressionable, and obsessed with the trad wife aesthetic she saw on TikTok. She wanted the long floral dresses, the homemade sourdough, the slow living, and the natural life. She hated the city. She hated the noise. She wanted to be reclaimed by the earth. They went hiking in a remote part of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Elena wanted a digital detox to stop herself from checking her Slack notifications every 4 minutes. Sophie wanted to take cottagecore photos in the wild berry patches. It was a Tuesday. The forest was unusually still, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the trees are holding their breath. They found a patch of wild huckleberries near an old crumbling stone foundation that shouldn't have been there. Elena turned her back for exactly 3 minutes to try and find a bar of cell service to send one last urgent email. When she turned back, Sophie was gone. Elena didn't panic at first. She called Sophie's name, expecting a laugh or a sarcastic reply from behind a bush. Nothing. She walked 50 yards into the tree line, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The air started to smell like vanilla. Not wild vanilla, but the synthetic, cloying scent of a luxury candle. She found Sophie 10 minutes later, sitting perfectly still on a mossy log. Sophie was holding a wicker basket, a basket she hadn't brought with her, filled with strawberries. Massive, glistening, deep red strawberries. In March, in the Pacific Northwest. Sophie, what the hell? Elena grabbed her shoulder. Where did you get these? We have to go. Sophie turned around, and Elena told me her heart didn't just skip a beat, it felt like it hit a wall. Sophie's face was perfect, too perfect. Her skin, which had been breaking out from the stress of finals week, was porcelain. Her eyes looked wider, the whites of them unnaturally bright, like someone had turned the vibrance slider up to 100 on a photo editor. I met the tall Mother L, Sophie whispered. Her voice had a strange melodic quality, like it was being played through a high-end filter. She told me I'm too tired. She said you're too tired. She said the city is a cage made of glass and glowing screens. Elena felt a surge of cold dread. Who, Sophie? Who did you meet? Sophie pointed toward a cluster of ancient, lightning-scarred fir trees. The mother. She lives in the house with no shadows. She said if I stay, I never have to work again. I just have to tend the garden. I just have to be. Elena looked where Sophie was pointing. There was no house. There was only a gap between the trees where the darkness seemed a little too solid. But as Elena stared, the mirage began to bleed into her own vision. She saw a flicker of a kitchen, a beautiful, sun-drenched farmhouse kitchen with copper pots and the smell of baking bread. It was exactly what Sophie had been pinboarding for years. It was a visual trap tailored specifically to a 19-year-old girl's deepest, most vulnerable desires. Then a figure stepped forward from the shadows. Elena described her as being nearly 7 feet tall. She wore a dress that looked like it was woven from dried grass and human hair. Her face was the most terrifying part. It wasn't a face, it was a filter. It was a static, unmoving image of a perfect woman, symmetrical, smiling, with glowing skin. But the image didn't match the 3D space it occupied. It flickered like a corrupted video file. When the entity moved, the face stayed perfectly centered, staring at Elena with eyes that didn't blink because they were just pixels of light. She wants us to join the hive, Elena, Sophie said, her voice becoming more monotone, more robotic. No more emails, no more rent, just the harvest. The tall mother reached out a hand. The fingers were too long, with too many joints, ending in nails that looked like polished ivory. She didn't speak with her mouth. Instead, Elena heard a notification sound, the exact ding of her iPhone, echoing inside her own skull. Accept the invite? The voice asked. Elena didn't think. She grabbed Sophie by the hair, the only way she could get a grip, and dragged her backward. She screamed at the top of her lungs, a raw, jagged sound that broke the aesthetic silence of the clearing. The moment she screamed, the farmhouse kitchen vanished. The vanilla smell turned into the stench of rotting meat and stagnant water. The tall mother let out a sound like a modem handshaking, a screeching, digital howl, and began to move toward them. She didn't walk. She glitched. She would be 10 feet away, then 5 feet away, then 8 feet away, her body teleporting in short, frame-skipping bursts. Elena ran. She dragged Sophie through thorns and mud, ignoring the way Sophie fought her, crying that she wanted to go back to the garden. They burst onto the main trail just as a group of seasoned hikers was passing by. The hikers saw 2 terrified women, one of them screaming about a glitch, the other staring blankly at a wicker basket full of gray, moldy rocks that she thought were strawberries. When we interviewed Elena at the ranger station, she was shaking so hard she couldn't hold a cup of water. Sophie was in a catatonic state. We went back to that clearing with 3 armed officers and 2 K-9 units. The dogs refused to enter the circle of trees. They whimpered and tucked their tails, staring up into the branches. We found the log where Sophie had been sitting. On it lay a single item, a small rectangular piece of wood, carved and painted to look exactly like an iPhone 15. On the screen of the wooden phone, someone had painstakingly etched a perfect replica of Elena's LinkedIn profile. Under the experience section, it had been updated. It didn't say junior analyst anymore. It said recurring asset pending collection. Elena quit her job the next day. She moved to a town in the desert where there are no trees and no cottagecore dreams. But she told me that sometimes, when she's scrolling through her phone late at night, her front-facing camera will activate for a split second. And in the reflection of the screen, she sees a tall, flickering woman in a grass dress, standing right behind her, waiting for her to finally, tiredly, click accept. If you spend any time on the advice or legal subreddits, you'll see one word pop up more than any other: gaslighting. It's a term that's lost some of its edge through overuse, but in its purest form, it is the most psychological of horrors. It is the process of having your sanity dismantled by someone you are supposed to trust. Usually, it happens in a relationship or a workplace. But in the deep woods, the forest itself can gaslight you. And sometimes, the people sent to save you are the ones holding the matches. This story comes from Sarah. Sarah and her best friend Chloe were the kind of duo that lived for the content. Chloe was a rising travel influencer, the kind of girl who could make a mosquito-infested swamp look like a 5-star spa on TikTok. They were hiking a treacherous, unnamed ridge in the North Cascades, searching for a specific, lonely cedar that Chloe's followers had been obsessing over. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the humidity was so high you could practically chew the air. They found the tree. It was a massive, ancient thing, its branches twisted like arthritic fingers reaching for a gray sky. Chloe, never one to miss a shot, decided she needed a POV video from the canopy. She wanted to show the edge of the world. She was a good climber, nimble, light, and fearless. Sarah watched from the base, holding Chloe's heavy gimbal and extra battery packs. She watched Chloe disappear into the thick, dark needles about 30 feet up. "I've got a signal," Chloe shouted from the branches. Her voice sounded bright, echoing strangely off the rock face. "Sarah, you wouldn't believe the view. It's like the forest just stops. There's nothing on the other side." "Be careful," Sarah yelled back. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The wind picked up, a low mourning howl that vibrated in Sarah's chest. "Chloe, come down. The weather's turning." No answer. Sarah waited 20 minutes. She threw small rocks into the branches, hoping to get a reaction. She screamed until her throat felt like it had been scraped with a wire brush. Nothing. No movement. No rustling of needles. Just the wind. Terrified, Sarah scrambled back toward the trailhead, screaming for help. By a stroke of what she thought was luck, she ran into a ranger about a mile down the path. He was tall, wearing a crisp olive-green uniform that looked too clean for the terrain. He wasn't wearing a name tag, but he had a radio that hissed with constant rhythmic static. "Sir, my friend Chloe. She climbed the cedar at the ridge. She won't come down. She's not answering." Sarah was hysterical, grabbing his arm. The ranger didn't move. He didn't even look toward the ridge. He just looked at Sarah with eyes that were a flat, milky gray, the color of a dead TV channel. "Miss," he said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm, "take a deep breath. You're suffering from altitude sickness. You've been wandering alone for hours." Sarah froze. "What? No. Chloe, we came here together. We parked the Jeep at the 402 marker. She's in the tree." The ranger pulled out a notebook. "I checked the 402 marker 10 minutes ago. There is a blue sedan there, registered to a Sarah Miller. No other passengers. No Jeep." Sarah felt a cold wave of nausea. That's impossible. We took Chloe's Jeep. My car is at the shop." "Memory can be very fragile in the high country," the ranger said, stepping closer. He didn't smell like pine or sweat. He smelled like ozone and burnt plastic. "You're dehydrated. You're hallucinating a companion to cope with the isolation. It's a common psychological defense mechanism. Now, let's get you back to the station so we can get you some clarity. He started leading her away, but Sarah caught a glimpse of his radio. It wasn't a radio. It was a solid block of molded plastic with no buttons, no speakers, just a smooth surface. And the static wasn't coming from the device. It was coming from the ranger's own throat. Sarah bolted. She didn't go toward the trailhead. She ran back to the ridge, back to the tree. She heard the ranger behind her, but he wasn't running. He was just walking, his heavy boots thudding in a perfect metronomic rhythm. Thud, thud, thud. She reached the cedar. The gimbal Chloe had dropped was still in the dirt. Sarah grabbed it, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped it again. She looked up and saw Chloe's phone snagged on a low branch just out of reach. She used the gimbal to hook the phone and pull it down. The screen was cracked, but the camera app was still open. It had been recording the whole time. Sarah hit play. On the video, she saw herself standing at the base of the tree. She saw Chloe's legs disappearing into the canopy. But as the camera panned up, Sarah saw the view Chloe had described. There was no forest on the other side of the ridge. There was just a flat, white void, like a map that hadn't finished loading. And then she saw the ranger. In the video, the ranger was standing directly behind Sarah. He had been there the entire time she was waiting for Chloe. He was leaning over her shoulder, his face inches from hers, mimicking her expressions. When Sarah cried, he made a silent, mocking, crying face. When she screamed Chloe's name, he opened his mouth wide in a silent scream. But in the video, the ranger's uniform wasn't olive green. It was made of the same bark as the cedar tree. His skin was rough and gray, and where his eyes should have been, there were just 2 hollow knots of wood. Sarah looked up from the phone. The ranger she had met on the trail was standing 20 feet away, still in his clean green uniform. "Sarah," he said, his voice now sounding exactly like Chloe's. "Why are you looking at that? You know the video is fake. You made it yourself. You're a very talented editor, Sarah, but you're so tired." He took another step. "Chloe isn't in the tree, Sarah. Chloe is the tree." Sarah looked at the cedar. She saw a patch of bark that looked like a human ear. She saw a branch that ended in 5 distinct fingernail-like tips. The tree began to groan, a deep, woody sound that resolved into a sob. Sarah didn't look back. She threw the phone into the brush and ran until the world turned into a blur of green and gray. She found a group of college students 5 miles away. They called the real authorities. The real SAR team found Sarah's car, a blue sedan, at the trailhead. Chloe's Jeep was never found. Chloe's social media accounts were deleted that night, but not by a person. The logs showed the IP address originated from a non-standard location in the middle of the national forest. Sarah spent 3 months in a psychiatric ward. The doctors told her it was a shared psychotic episode, followed by dissociative fugue. They told her Chloe never existed. They showed her her own birth certificate, her own school records. None of them mentioned a friend named Chloe, but Sarah sent me a DM a month ago. She found an old Polaroid in the back of a drawer. It's a picture of her and a girl with bright blonde hair standing in front of a blue Jeep. The girl's face is scratched out, not with a pen, but with what looks like the physical growth of wood grain appearing directly on the surface of the photo. And at the bottom of the photo, in Chloe's handwriting, it says, "Don't believe them. The static is just the sound of the trees talking over us." Sarah doesn't go outside anymore. She says the trees in her suburban backyard are starting to look a little too much like people she used to know. And every morning, she finds a small pile of cedar needles on her pillow, even though her windows are locked tight. If you've spent 5 minutes on r/no sleep or r/backwoodscreepy, you know about the stairs. It's the one story every search and rescue officer is officially told to ignore. We call it the white noise of the woods. You're out 40 miles from the nearest paved road, in a place where the brush is so thick you have to crawl on your belly, and suddenly, there it is, a perfect set of stairs. Sometimes they're carpeted, sometimes they're marble, sometimes they're just raw, unfinished pine. They don't lead anywhere, they don't have a house attached, they just exist. Most people who find them feel a physical repulsion. It's like a glitch in the simulation that your brain tries to patch by making you look away. But there's a new trend on social media, the main character energy. The idea that everything in the world is a backdrop for your personal journey. And that is exactly how the stairs get you. They don't hunt you, they invite you. This story comes from Riley. Riley was a survivor. not just of the woods, but of a 10-year relationship with a man who had slowly, methodically stripped away her sense of self. She was out in the Alpine Lakes wilderness on a solo reclamation hike. She wanted to prove she could navigate the world without a voice in her ear telling her she was incompetent. It was a crisp October afternoon. The larches were turning gold, dropping needles like flakes of rusted metal. Riley was off trail, using a compass and a topo map, feeling a rare sense of pride. That's when she saw them. In a clearing of charred trees, remnants of a fire from a decade ago, stood a staircase. They weren't spooky or ancient. They were beautiful. They were polished oak with a white banister and a runner made of deep forest green velvet. Riley froze. Her first instinct was the correct one. This shouldn't be here. This is impossible. But then she heard the sound. It wasn't a monster's roar. It was the sound of a pen scratching on paper. Scribble, scribble, pause, scribble. Riley walked closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she reached the base of the stairs, she realized the oak was identical to the staircase in the house she had shared with her ex-partner. Even the small scuff mark on the third step, the one she had made when she dropped a moving box, was there. And then she heard the voice. It was her own voice. But it wasn't her voice now. It was her voice from 3 years ago, sounding small and uncertain. The voice was coming from the top of the stairs, which ended abruptly about 12 feet in the air, leading into nothing but the cold mountain sky. The voice was reading. October 14th. He told me today that I'm lucky to have him. He said no one else would put up with my moods. I think he's right. I'm so tired of being the problem. Riley felt a wave of nausea so intense she almost fell. Those were her private journals, the ones she had burned in a bonfire 6 months ago. Who's up there? Riley screamed. Who has my book? The voice didn't stop. It just turned the page. November 2nd. I tried to go for a walk today, but he said the woods are dangerous for someone like me. He said I'd get lost in my own head. He said I need him to keep me grounded. The stairs weren't just a physical object. They were an entitlement trap. They were playing back her trauma, using her own history to trigger a main character response. The stairs weren't just there. They were hers. They were a monument to her pain, and in the twisted logic of the woods, that felt like an invitation. Riley, the voice called out, shifting slightly. It wasn't her reading anymore. It was her ex-partner's voice. It was perfect. The same condescending lilt, the same concerned tone that felt like a chokehold. Riley, honey, you're wandering again. You're doing exactly what I said you'd do. Come up here. Let's talk about why you feel the need to run away. Riley found herself putting a foot on the first step. The green velvet felt warm, unnaturally warm, like it had a pulse. You're not real, Riley whispered, but she took another step. He's at home. He's 300 miles away. I'm wherever you carry me, the voice said from the top. And look at you. You found the stairs. You're so special, Riley. No one else finds these. This is your moment. This is where you prove you're the protagonist, right? Come up and see the ending. Riley was on the 4th step, then the 5th. The higher she went, the more the forest around her began to dim. The gold larches turned gray. The sky turned the color of a bruised lung. She reached the 7th step. She looked down at the banister. She expected to see white paint, but as she gripped it, the paint began to flake off in her hand. It wasn't wood underneath. It was calcified bone. The white banister was a long, curved rib cage, polished until it shone. The velvet runner wasn't fabric. It was a dense, mossy growth of human hair, dyed green by the dampness of the forest. Riley stopped. The main character spell broke. She realized the stairs weren't a path to closure. They were an altar. No, Riley said. She turned to go back down, but the stairs had grown. What had been 7 steps was now a flight of 50, stretching down into a bottomless pit of black needles and fog. Don't be dramatic, Riley, the voice at the top snapped. The concerned mask was gone. Now it was just raw, predatory entitlement. You started this. You wanted to be seen. Well, something is looking at you now. Finish the climb. Riley didn't look up. She sat down on the bone step and closed her eyes. She remembered what a veteran SAR officer had told her during her training. The woods can only use what you bring into them. If you give them nothing, they have nothing to build with. She began to recite her topo map coordinates, out loud. 47 degrees, 32 minutes north. 121 degrees, 8 minutes west. Elevation 5,000 feet. She repeated it like a mantra. She stripped away the story. She stripped away the trauma. She turned herself into a data point, a coordinate, a piece of the physical world that didn't belong to a narrative. Click, clack, the sound of the stairs shifting. They didn't like being ignored. They didn't like being treated as a math problem. "Riley, get back here," the voice screamed, but it was losing its shape. It started to sound like a bobcat, a high, screeching wail that had no words left. Riley kept her eyes shut and slid off the step, falling into the dirt. She didn't stand up. She crawled. She crawled on her hands and knees for what felt like miles, her face in the mud, until she heard the sound of a real stream. When she finally opened her eyes, the sun was setting. She was back on the trail. Her hands were covered in white dust, bone meal. When Riley told us the story, she wasn't looking for sympathy. She was looking for a confirmation. "They weren't my stairs, were they?" she asked me. "No," I told her. "They just used your blueprint." We found the clearing 3 days later. The charred trees were there, but the ground was scorched in a perfect rectangle, as if something incredibly hot had been sitting there and then vanished. In the center of the rectangle was a single used pen, Riley's favorite brand. It was out of ink. The stairs are still out there. They change for everyone. For some, they're a promotion. For some, they're a lost child. For Riley, they were the ultimate test of her main character syndrome. Because in the woods, the only thing worse than being ignored is being noticed by something that thinks it owns your story. We've talked about the workplace office chairs, the aesthetic traps of the tall mother, and the gaslighting trees that swallow your friends. But there is one story I usually keep for the very end of the night, the one that explains why I don't look in mirrors after a long shift. In the search and rescue world, we are trained to be the anchor. We are the logical, physical presence that pulls people back from the brink of the unknown. But what happens when the unknown decides it wants a piece of the anchor? Last November, I was part of a team sent to recover a hiker named Lily. She had been missing for 4 days in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie forest. By the time we found her, she was huddled under a rotted cedar log, shivering so hard I thought her teeth would crack. She was missing her boots, her backpack was gone, and her eyes were fixed on the tree line behind us with a terrifying intensity. She wasn't injured, just in deep shock. As I helped her walk back toward the trailhead, she kept leaning into me, her voice a dry, papery whisper. "Is he still following us?" she asked. I scanned the woods. Thermal goggles showed nothing but the cold trunks of the trees. "No one's there, Lily. You're safe. It's just us." "He has black eyes," she muttered, stumbling over a root. "And he won't stop making faces at you. He's standing right behind your shoulder, mimicking the way you breathe. He says your jacket is too loud." I felt a prickle of sweat on my neck, despite the freezing air. I've heard shock talk before, but this felt different. It felt like she was reading a script I couldn't see. The closer we got to the base camp, the more agitated Lily became. She stopped dead in her tracks, turned around, and began screaming into the dark. "Leave her alone! She's not yours! Go back to the holes in the ground!" And then I heard it. It wasn't a voice. It was a noise, a rhythmic, wet, coughing sound. Huh-cough. Huh-cough. It sounded deep, almost insect-like, vibrating in the very air around us. It didn't have a location. It was everywhere at once. Lily turned to me, her eyes wider than I thought humanly possible. She reached out and touched the back of my neck, right at the base of my skull. "He says to tell you to speed up," she whispered. "He says he doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck anymore. It ruins the symmetry of the feast." I froze. I have a very small, thin scar at the base of my neck, a childhood injury from a fence. It is always covered by my high-collared SAR jacket. It is impossible to see unless you are looking for it under a microscope. The moment she said it, the huh-cough sound happened directly in my right ear. Not 3 feet away, inside my ear canal. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I grabbed Lily's arm and I hiked. I hiked faster than I ever have in my life, my heart a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. I didn't look back. I didn't look at the thermal feed. I just moved. When we reached Ops and Lily was loaded into the ambulance, she looked at me one last time. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked, sorry for me. "It's already under the skin," she said. I went home that night and stood in my bathroom. I locked the door. I turned off the main light and used only a small candle, just like the scary story threads tell you to do when you're looking for things that don't want to be seen. I turned my back to the mirror and held up a hand glass. The scar was there, as it had been for 20 years. But around it, the skin had changed. There was a perfect blackened fingerprint pressed into my spine. It looked like a bruise, but when I touched it, I couldn't feel my own hand. It felt like I was touching someone else's body. And the fingerprint wasn't static. As I watched in the mirror, the edges of the bruise shifted. It was growing. It was shaped like a hand, a long, jointed hand with too many fingers, slowly wrapping itself around my neck from the inside out. So, if you go into the woods, remember, the forest isn't just a place, it's a predator that learns. It learns your face, it learns your trauma, and it learns your secrets. Be safe. Bring a map. Bring a friend. But most importantly, don't let them see your scars, because once they know where the skin is broken, they never stop trying to get inside.